I'm a huge Kubelwagen fan, and recently the Plastic Pussy podcast started a small group build in which you had to build one of the new Meng Kubelwagens. There were 3 kits to choose from: a Desert Africa Core Kubelwagen, an Eastern Front Kubelwagen, and lastly the rather obscure VW823, which was a training vehicle. And this is my entry to that group build. I'm James and you're watching LPJ Models. The Type 823 was a turreted Kubelwagen used for crew training. It was kinda seen as a tank replacement, and the Meng kit is quite nice, but it is missing 2 very important features. The vehicle was occasionally seen with 2 side sponsoons, making it look much more like a tank. So that is something I'm going to have to address. The kit parts themselves are pretty nice. They're crisp and well detailed, although the colour of the plastic does make some of this detail quite hard to see. And being pretty new kits, flash is non-existent, and mold witness seams are, again, fairly non-existent. As a testament to the detail on the kit, this VW logo is super crisp and super tiny. The clear parts look nice and are scratch-free, which is good. Sadly though, the kit does come with rubber tyres. I'll fix this later too. And we have a tiny decal sheet. Looks like we're going to need some upgrades, so I hopped onto Fusion 360 and designed an entire suite of parts for this kit. You can find them at cults3d.com/@LPJmodels. So I made up some new sponsoons, some tyres. The tyres are slightly sagged apart from the nose one, an MG13 to go inside the turret. This was probably the most fun thing I made. A completely new turret designed from the ground up, including the hull roof, just so I could have it open, and a cobbled base where I used a height map to stamp the texture onto an oval. As I said before, these files are available on Cults 3D for a small price, or free if you're a Patreon. So we've got a lot of techniques to cram into this tour de force of a video. Let's get on with the build. The build of the Kubelwagen itself starts in a rather conventional place: the underside of the hull. Unlike the Tamiya 1/35 offering, this is built up in multiple parts, with the rear and front wheel arch sections being completely separate. But the transmission and lower engine assembly are very similar. Annoyingly, on the inner surfaces there were quite a few ejector pin marks to address. These were filled with sprue goo and then carefully filed down. I know ejector pin marks are important when it comes to injection moulding, but it's such a shame that these were on such prominent locations. Because the interior is fairly enclosed, you might be able to get away with not filling them. But because I planned to have my turret open, I needed to make sure these were filled nicely. The front torsion bar suspension was then carefully glued into place, and the front wheel arch assembly was glued to the hull. Everything here fit really nicely. These Kubelwagen kits come with the interior engine firewalls moulded with detail, so I think that's a hint that an engine may be coming from Meng in the future. And already we're onto some paint. For some tonal variation in the interior, I decided to paint the floor primer red. This will contrast with the Elfenbein or cream white interior later. These red sections were carefully masked with masking tape and VMS masking fluid. Only a quarter of this entire surface will be seen later, namely the area underneath the driver's seat. I painted the rest of the interior surfaces, firstly with a mix of primer red, grey and brown. These surfaces were then given a light layer of Humbrol chipping fluid, before being painted with AK Real Colors cream white. This was built up in light layers, not only to add some variety, but to make it easier to chip later. The wooden duckboards were given a preliminary layer of Tamiya's dark yellow No. 2. This is to prepare them for some wood grain, added later on. Okay, let's see how that masking came out. Looks good. Some warm water and a stiff Tatiel brush was used to chip away some of that white paint. I wanted my underlying chips to be multicoloured to show various stages of wear. That's why I went for my Harlequin style multicolour undercoat. In some areas I used a toothpick to add some different scratches and to encourage the paint to chip more. Continuing on the interior of the vehicle, I added this small 3D printed magazine case, or at least that's what I think it is. This small part is why I modelled a complete MG13, because it looks suspiciously like it would fit MG13 ammo mags. This was carefully glued in with some VMS superglue. And the rest of the interior was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500. I'm liking the mahogany shade at the moment. My multicolour base coat was then sprayed over the entirety of the rest of the interior. I mainly used RLM 66, marking red, both MRP shades, and some AK Real Colour Dunkel Brown. Again, this was given a layer of Humbrol chipping fluid, before being sprayed with more cream white. The dashboard for the Kubel was then detail painted. This mostly consisted of me using some AK 3rd Gen black. Once this was painted, I popped in the single interior decal, which was the speedo and mileometer. The little divot was prepared with some VMS decal set and fix, and the decal was carefully slid into place. This was followed up with some VMS decal softener, and then a small dab of UV clear resin, just to give the impression of glass. You've got to be really careful when applying this, because it's really hard to remove if you get it in the wrong place. A little shine of the UV torch and that piece of glass was complete. Let's paint the seats with some cool leather effects. I've already done a video on this, but let's do it again just in case you haven't seen it. I want these seats to be black leather, so I'm starting with a slightly lightened black base. A mix of black and flesh was painted all over. I then used progressively lighter shades of grey stippled on with an old sponge. This will help give the leather some texture. You can do the same with various shades of brown. It's a really easy technique, and it looks really effective when it's done. With my stippling done, I used an ultra-fine Kolinsky sable brush and some Vallejo white grey to brush in some scratches and creases. With the scratches done, I used some AK 3rd Gen Ochre Brown to add some areas of the leather that have been chipped away completely. After painting these, I lightened the colour with white and added small lighter chips inside. Now it's time to tie those leather effects together with an oil paint glaze. Here I'm using some Abteilung 502 black, thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier, and a tiny drop of their Oil Expert fast drying medium. Not only do the oils add a nice transparent layer, they also add a slight sheen, adding to the authenticity of the leather. And this is how both of the seats came out. I think they look pretty good. Next up, it's time to add some wood grain to those running boards. I used a mix of burnt umber, sepia and shadow brown oil paints and brushed these all over the running boards. I then used my rather splayed tatty brush to gently brush in an impression of wood grain. Before I could glue these parts on, I needed to add a small wash to the lower hull. I used some Abteilung 502 Starship filth and then glued the running boards in place. This was followed by adding the floor of the fighting compartment. The rest of the interior components could then be brought together, adding the seat, the storage locker and the sidewalls. I then used Abteilung 502 Starship filth and Shadow Brown to add some washes and grime to the interior. These oils were thinned again with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. Slightly thicker applications were brushed around the edges of the floor. Once the floor was suitably grimy, I used a Terry Harrison soft blender brush to gently dab at the oils and blend them in. The interior weathering was finished with a light speckle of dark oil colours, just to add some drops and stains. It's time to start bringing the rest of the vehicle together. Luckily, the fit on these parts was pretty good. I do think, however, I could have scraped away some more paint from the joins to make it fit even better. It's at this stage I needed to mask and fit the transparent parts. These were edged with thin masking tape and then filled in with VMS liquid mask. I then used some VMS Transperfix 6K to glue these parts in place. Now it's time to add one of my first major conversion parts, the roof. It fits pretty good straight out of the printer, but I did need to sand some of the plastic parts just to make the fit perfect. This was then glued in place with some VMS slow setting CA glue. I then added the lamps that I redesigned. The plastic parts were pretty blobby, so I designed some hollow lamps in which I could apply some clear UV resin later. It's then time to remove the turret from its supports. To do this, I used my CMK razor saw. I do need to get a new handle as this one is slightly broken. With my newfound Fusion 360 confidence, maybe I can redesign one. Anyway, after a few slices, the turret was pulled away from the rest of the supports, and all I needed to do was some light sanding on the underneath. The original turret, whilst passable, was moulded in such a way that you couldn't see any of the interior. Also, some of those seam lines would be quite hard to hide. But I also wanted the option of having the hatch open. I did also rather ambitiously design a hinge with a hole all the way through, but I don't have any stiff wire that fine. I also designed a speculative head cushion for the inside of the turret. Plausible fantasy. Anyway, the hatch was removed from its supports, and as there were a few visible layer lines on this part, they needed to be removed. I used varying grades of sandpaper from 800 to 2500 to tidy these up. And with the turret assembly complete, well, it wasn't much of an assembly, it just slots right on top. I had to remove some much larger supports from the wheels I designed. 2 years ago I would have laughed if you told me that I designed parts like this for my own kits. If an idiot like me can do it, anybody can. All it took was some practice and some guidance from some really kind people. To finish off the wheels, they needed a light sand just to round the edges and make the tyres look a little softer. Way after I'd filmed this section, I'd already redesigned the sponsoons several times to make sure they fit perfectly. But originally, they were designed in 2 parts. I kept this footage in because these parts are quite important. And they were the last thing I did before moving on to the painting. Which was started, of course, with a primer layer of Mr. Surfacer 1500 mahogany. I then had some surface tidying to do, some extra seams to fill. For this I used some sandpaper and some super glue. And well, somehow in this process I managed to glue the Kubelwagen to my finger. Marvellous. VMS debonder saved the day and everything was tidied up and re-primed again. I then pre-painted the entire model with some RLM66, red, brown, dark brown and black, you know, for that multicoloured chipping effect again. The model was given a layer of Humbrol chipping fluid, and it was time for my first layer of Panzer Grey. For the first layer, I used some thin coats of AK Real Colour Panzer Grey, which is really dark. Now dark is pretty authentic, but I wanted this one to be a little lighter. So I then used some MRP RLM66 to add some highlights and light mottled modulation. To my RLM66 I added some MRP Blue Grey. This was for my lightest layer of paint, and I found that this blue grey lightens the RLM66 nicely without shifting the colour. Here I'm using my Harder & Steenbeck 0.15 Infinity CR to add some extra highlight mottles. The paint is extra thin, 70% thinner, 30% paint, and I'm spraying it around 15 psi. The tyres were painted with a mix of black and PC10, which was a green-brown. I then painted 4 out of the 5 hubs with Panzer Grey and 1 with MRP marking red, just for some variation. I then glued the wheels in place. I was really pleased that my designed hubs fit the kit parts. The entire model was then carefully chipped. MRP, however, is a little tougher to chip, so I needed some extra time and effort and the help of some sandpaper in areas to add some very subtly chipped paint. It's now time to add the rest of the decals to the kit, which were pretty much 2 license plates. The surfaces were prepared with VMS Decal Set and Fit, as per normal. Straight over the paint again, no gloss. Once the decals were in place, they were given a layer of VMS Decal Softener, just to help them stick down even more. It's time now to paint some of those details around the Kubel. I think I got this bit completely wrong. I painted them as kind of anti-slip black, but in reference images, they look to be grey. Whoops! The handholds on either side of the sponsoons were also painted black, and lightly highlighted off camera. The model was given a layer of VMS satin varnish to protect the paintwork and unify the finish. I wanted this vehicle to have a slight sheen, that's why I used satin varnish. Always a nerve-wracking step, it's time to remove some of that masking. This piece really didn't want to come out, but I got there in the end. My machine gun was primed with Mr. Colour GX2 and then lightly sprayed with a mix of Alclad steel and GX2, just to darken it. The machine gun was then given a thin wash of Abteilung 502 Midnight Blue mixed with black. This helped to give a blue tinge to the gun and pick out some of those lovely 3D printed details. And with some careful positioning, the gun was carefully popped into place. It fits, but it is a little awkward to get it through the hole. There we go. Not neglecting the underside, I painted the exhaust pipes with some MRP burnt iron and finished it off with some Mr. Hobby Superfine Silver. The centre engine housing, cover, whatever, was then painted with some gloss black. This was then glued in place along with my modified transmission cover. The main kit came with the option of some fabric covered headlights, which I went for. The fabric was painted with some US olive base AK 3rd Gen. This is very similar to Vallejo's Russian uniform World War II, which I'd usually use for fabric like that. The wing mirror and the inside of the lamps were then painted with an AK chrome pen. It's not perfect, but at this size, it's forgivable. The rear reflector was painted chrome, and then some Tamiya clear red was brushed over the top. And I added a very light misting of dust with some Tamiya dark yellow too, thinned around 95% mist leveling thinner to 5% paint. I then masked off the areas that the hilariously small window wipers would clean, and sprayed the same dusty mix over the top. I then used some of that UV resin again to fill in the lamps. To add a little bit more life and more tonal variation to the model, I added some more modulation with some light grey oils. The light grey I used was mixed from black, blue and white. It was brushed in place and then blended in with my soft blender brush. Once my modulation was done, I applied a dark wash to the entire vehicle. For this, I simply used some Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown, thinned again with VMS UWC. For the almost final stage of the paintwork, some of the excess wash was wiped away with a cotton bud, just to tidy it up and make sure there were no unsightly stains. I then glued on the sponsoons, and that was that for the Kubelwagen. But we've still got a way to go before I can call this little scene complete. So let's set the Kubelwagen aside and try not to let it get too dusty as we crack on with the base. My oval cobblestone base was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 Black. Not gonna lie, I'm really stoked with how this base came out. I still need to play with the method some more, but it's really promising. Once the base was primed, it was time to add some tonal variation. These things are rarely one colour, so I started by stippling some tan and grey acrylics all over the entire model with a sponge. I then added some Liquitex raw umber ink and did exactly the same. Blobbed it on, dabbed it in. To start emulating some of the dirt caught between the cobbles, I added some acrylic washes of browns, tans and greys. It doesn't matter too much exactly what the colour is, as long as it's dusty and earthy. To speed things along, I used my hairdryer, or as I call it, Danny Dryer, to dry my paint quickly, so I could get on to painting the individual cobbles. Again, I used various tans and greys, but I also looked at some reference images online, just to make sure I got the vibe right. Then, to add the impression of vegetation, I applied a wash of AK moss deposits. This was brushed around some of the cracks, and then I used some oil thinner to spread it out and blend it in. I did have to do this again later on. I made the mistake of doing it at too early a stage, but it shows you what I did. I then added some more contrast on the rest of the base with some Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown. To make these cobbles realistic, I'm going to need many layers and lots of different techniques to make it look as authentic as I can. The next step was to add some earth pigments. For this, I used the Humbrol ones, thinned with some Universal Weathering Carrier. I then carefully wiped the excess away. It didn't look like there was enough grime between the cobbles, so I used some VMS Diorama texture, fine grey earth, to add some more collected grit and dirt. This was sprinkled over some oil paint, and then carefully rubbed in with my finger. I then used more oil paint to seal it in, kind of like a gluey paint wash, and for this I used Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown. Everything was then given a rub with a strong kitchen towel to make sure the dirt only remained in the crevices. I then reapplied some of those moss effects, and to add more realism to the base, I polished some of the raised cobbles with an Infini Model sanding stick. These cobbles are old and would have been polished and worn down with time. Also, adding some micro-reflective surfaces should add a lot of realism to the finished build. I'm really pleased with how this came out. So we've got the base and the Kubelwagen. What's next? Well, we've got some luggage. And by luggage, I mean some suitcases, a chair and a barrel. The wooden items were painted with sand colours. The chair, Tamiya Dark Yellow 2, and the barrel, MRP's Pale Wood. This is to prep the items for some oil wood grain. Before I could go further with the barrel, however, I had to mask off the metal areas, the bands, and paint them. I gave them a spray of some various rusty tones, before applying a layer of chipping fluid, and then a dark black metallic colour. I looked at hundreds of barrel reference photos before painting this. It was actually pretty sad, but it meant I could get the colours just right. And after chipping away some of the dark layer, I was pleased, so it was time to add the wood grain. For the chair, I wanted to do a stained pine chair, stained with a warm stain. For this I mixed up some alizarin crimson and burnt umber oils and brushed this over the entire chair, before brushing in some wood grain effects. The barrel was given some more normal wood colours, using burnt umber, yellow ochre and shadow brown to add the wood grain. With the wood items done, it's time to move on to the luggage itself. I found these STLs on Cults 3D and I'll leave the link in the description, as well as for the chair and the barrel. Firstly, they were painted brown, and then given a stipple of Vallejo's light flesh. Similar to my wood grain chair, they were distressed and then brushed over with a layer of oil paint. For the brown suitcase, I used burnt umber, but for some colour and variation, I didn't just want some brown suitcases. So the other two will be a little more colourful. For the banding on the brown suitcase and the locks, I used some Darkstar rich gold paint. For the second suitcase, the smaller one, I used some red tones, alizarin crimson and cadmium red deep oils. And for the final one, I went for a blue-grey fabric look. For the fittings on this one, I used some Darkstar tarnished steel. This was finished off with a dark wash of Abteilung 502 Shadow Brown and Starship Filth, just to add some shadow and some grime. And that's the diorama furniture complete. It's time to move on to the figure and the good boy. The figure I chose for this scene comes from PanzerArt and comes with a puppy. I couldn't decide whether to use a Wehrmacht soldier or a tanker, so I went for the one with the dog. The figure and the puppy are really nicely detailed, and the puppy himself has got some really big paws. I like that the sculptor was really committed to keeping this dog anatomically correct. The figure was glued together with VMS Flexi 5K CA for 3D parts. While the parts were mastered in 3D, they were cast in resin, by the manufacturer, not me. And he fit together really nicely. Let's get some paint on the figure. First off, he was primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 mahogany, much like everything else in this build. His uniform was given a base layer of MRP SSC 14 blue-black, a nice slightly lighter base for my black Panzer uniform. The face was then given a layer of MRP Pale Wood. I'm trying different face painting techniques at the moment, and this is one of them. I'm using a solid base of pale wood before painting in the eyes. These are done with Vallejo green-grey, as well as the teeth, as this figure has them visible. I then painted in the irises with a dark grey-blue mix. For this, I'm using an ultra-fine 000 Artis Opus Kolinsky sable. The irises were then lightened with some bright light blue Vallejo mix. Well, I messed that up, didn't I? And I tried really hard to paint in the pupils, but I didn't do a very good job. Instead of going from dark to light, I'm working from a mid-tone and using glazes to build up layers of colour, starting with the shadows, using a mix of Vallejo cork brown and hull red. Thinned a tremendous amount. These glazes were brushed lightly over the areas where the shadows were to go. It was then time for some highlights, which were started with a mix of Vallejo's light flesh mixed with a tiny drop of cork brown. Again, these were brushed in very thin glaze-like passes. The highlights were finished with some pure light flesh. And the lips were painted in with a purpley grey brown. The closest equivalent in Vallejo would probably be salmon rose. The hair was then blocked in with some flat yellow mixed with flesh. This fella's gonna be blonde, a colour I don't usually tackle when it comes to doing hair anyway. And to warm up the face and the cheeks, the face was given a glaze of Liquitex ink Pyrrole Red, again heavily thinned. The face was finished with some stubble painted in using a mixture of black and flesh. This was mainly done around the back and sides of the head. There's no 5 o'clock shadow for this guy. Don't worry, that bit around the ear was wicked away before I finished it. And this is how the face came out using only extra thin glazes over a lacquer base. It's time to tackle the uniform, and over that MRP base I mixed up some black with Liquitex Muted Grey ink, which is a purpley black colour. These were brushed in the shadowy areas before using Sergio's technique for adding highlights by using hatching on the upper surfaces of the figure, using progressively lighter greys made from black mixed with flesh. Everything was then coated in a glaze of black to tie everything together and shift the colour back towards the black of the Panzer uniform. I then picked out the rest of the details using various Vallejo and AK 3rd Gen colours. And his head was popped on. The figure was complete. It's now time to paint the doggy. For my painting reference, well, I've been playing a lot of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 lately, and I want to pay homage to our player companion, Mutt.
Good boy, good boy.
While the breed isn't the same, he does look quite similar.
Here you go, take it.
And I could get away with painting him exactly the same. So to paint our Mutt, I first gave the dog a layer of Tamiya lacquer white. This was sort of black based or brown based over the figure, adding more intensity of white to the lighter areas. I then used sponge stippling to add some various browns and greys to the coat of the dog, for tonal variation. This was then given a mist layer of white over the mottles to blend it all in. Don't worry, he won't look too dirty. This is just a very subtle method to add some variation. I then painted in his brown spots, using my 0.15 harder and Steenbeck. I used a mix of MRP red-brown with some yellow and red for vibrancy. I then painted his nose, his eyes and his mouth, using blacks for the nose and browns for the eyes, and a variety of red, pink and grey shades for the mouth. And after 1 or 2 subtle highlights and shadows, my good boy was complete. And it was time to start putting the finishing touches to my small vignette. You might think, hooray, we've finished, but there is one more step before I can call this complete. I wanted to add some detritus to the base, so I used some Model Scene 135 scale leaves. The shapes of these are great, but the colours aren't so much, so I glued a load of them in place and then painted them all individually with oil paints. I wanted it to look a little autumnal, so I used reds, yellows, greens and browns. I then used PVA to glue the figure and the dog carefully into place. And the build was complete. I'd like to say a huge and heartfelt thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Your support is much appreciated and helps keep the channel running. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank you for watching. I really enjoyed this small vignette, and I hope you did too. Although it took a lot longer than the 1 week that I predicted, closer to 6, it was fun all the way, from designing all the parts to painting the figure and building Meng's fantastic little kit. It's also an obscure subject, which adds to the fun list in my book. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment letting me know what you think. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.